founded and directed CIPO, Comunicação Interactiva, a non-governmental organization dedicated to guaranteeing the rights of children, adolescents, and young people through the educational use of communication and technology. Second, we have George Werner. He has served as Liberia's Minister of Education from 2015 until 2018. As a minister, despite inheriting an education system devastated by years of civil war and the Ebola outbreak, he held bold reforms such as the Getting to Best program, which aim at overhauling the education system to give all Liberian children access to free, quality education. He also launched the Partnership Schools for Liberia PSL initiative, now called LEAP, leveraging the experience of local and international education providers to deliver rapid gains in education quality for Liberia's children. Mr. Werner also led an initiative to remove ghost teachers from the ministry payroll, vetting the 18,000 teacher workforce and freeing up 2.4 million per year for reinvestment in the education system. Following the election of President George Weah in late 2017, Mr. Werner was selected by outgoing President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf to lead the human development aspect of her transition team, where he played a pivotal role in facilitating the first peaceful transfer of power in Liberia in more than 70 years. Third, we have Beatriz Pon. Having focused on education policy through her career, Dr. Beatriz Pon is passionate about improving education for children internationally. At the OECD, she supports countries with their education policy implementation and has had the chance to work with Greece, Japan, Mexico, Norway, Sweden, and the United Kingdom, Wales, in their school improvement efforts. She has specialized on school leadership, equity, and quality in education and reforms more generally, launching a comparative series education policy outlook and an organization-wide project on the political economy of reform. She has published and presented internationally on many of these topics. Asia Kazmi is the global education policy lead at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Asia's 25-year career in education began as a mathematician teacher in the UK. Before joining the Gates Foundation, Asia was in PricewaterhouseCoopers leading the Girls Education Challenge, an £800 million pound fund set up by the UK Department of International Development to support the education of 1.5 million girls in 17 countries. Asia has worked in 3 UK government departments as a senior education advisor in the DFID station in Pakistan, a senior Her Majesty inspector in Ofsted, and a project director in the Department for Education. Finally, we also have our colleague, Toby Linden, who is the practice manager for the East Asia and Pacific region of the World Bank's Education Global Practice. Formerly, he has the lead education specialist in the World Bank's Group Education practice as well, where he led the bank's education team in India. He has a long and diverse career working in different countries across the globe with the World Bank, as well as stint as executive director of the Roma Education Fund, based in Budapest, Hungary. His past work focused primarily on secondary and higher education, including working with the national and state governments on reforming India's system of 30,000 higher education institutions. As you can see, we have a very nice set of panelists, and I want to pass, give the opportunity to Asad, who is going to be our moderator today. Over to you, Asad.
Thank you, Juan, and good day to all those who are listening around the world. Thank you to the World Bank for partnering with us for this series of 3 webinars that we put together. As Juan mentioned, this is the 3rd in this series. And we really appreciate the effort that the World Bank has taken to highlight this issue, which we feel is emerging as a very strong area of interest in countries' attempts to reignite their efforts to improve educational outcomes for their children. As Juan introduced the panelists, I was struck by how vast their experience is and how deep it is. And so I hope that we'll have a very lively discussion today among the panelists who have been deeply immersed in improving education around the world. So this panel will really examine how countries can set up school leaders with an enabling environment in which they can thrive. This means that we often think of training school leaders as being the core of strengthening this lever of school leadership. But we know that there are a number of factors that also play into a school leader's life, like how are they selected? How much are they empowered to take decisions? And what are they held accountable for? So for the purpose of this panel, we're going to move from a locally rooted perspective from Brazil and Liberia to more global perspectives. So I encourage audience members to please put questions as they arise in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And we will have time after the remarks from the panelists to get into audience Q&A. And I'll periodically remind you to keep adding questions so that we'll have a more interactive discussion as we move towards the end of the panel. So to begin the panel, first up, we have Ana Penido, who leads the newly created Liman Center in Brazil. It's less than 6 months old. They are also GSL, Global School Leaders' newest partner organization, working on school leadership as a means of strengthening the Brazilian education system. Ana, we're so delighted to have you here today to share with us the Brazilian story on school leadership. Let me just begin by saying that your center is located in the city of Sobral in the northeast of Brazil. It's not a city that people think of when they think of Brazil normally, but it's located there for a specific reason, because Sobral is an example of how a municipality used school leadership to really reform and strengthen its education system. So could I ask you to begin this panel by reflecting upon the experience of Sobral and how the Liman Center plans to build off of their efforts in Sobral to create a more equitable education system in Brazil? Over to you, Ana.
Thank you, Azad. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today sharing our experiences and, of course, learning from all of you. If you allow me, I want to start just sharing a little bit of how school leaders are dealing with the pandemic here in Brazil, because this is affecting everything that is related to them and the decisions that they will have to make, they are having to make now to really overcome a lot of challenges. And then I'll try to explain how the example of Sobral is supporting us in supporting the school leaders to deal with all the challenges that they are facing now. So I'll start just telling you that on-site classes in Brazil were suspended in March 2020, and they have been gradually restarted since May this year. And the majority of schools only returned to regular operation last month. So it was almost 2 years without regular classes. In July, we supported a global school leader survey with 777 school leaders, 80% of them female, 72% between the ages of 41 and 60 years old, and 90% from public schools. And the survey showed that during this period, almost all school leaders organized remote classes, distributed printed materials, and supported families in helping their children with schoolwork. But still, almost half of their schools had no contact with at least 25% of their students. More than 4 million Brazilian students started the pandemic without any access to technology. And in the North and Northeast regions of the country, more than 30% of students did not have any access to educational activities or materials during the entire time that schools were closed. So learning losses are significant and educational inequalities have intensified. When returning to in-person classes, the main concern of these school leaders has been to take care of the physical and mental health of teachers and students and restore the learning that was compromised during the pandemic. And more than 75% of school leaders report that their students have lost at least one family member to COVID-19, while 15% report that the death of students or school staff members during the crisis. So almost 10% report not knowing what to do in this situation, and ask for guidance from teachers, families, and themselves, in addition to psychological support services from those most affected. So more than 60% of school principals are also concerned about students' families who have lost jobs and income during the pandemic. To make matters worse, there's a risk that a large proportion of students will drop out of school. The vast majority of principals want to do more to help students and teachers. However, there is still a lot of uncertainty on what they have to do or can do to restore learning, help teachers and students deal with emotional constraints, and rebuild their school's social fabric that was dismantled during the pandemic. Municipal and state education secretariats of education and civil society organizations are working hard to support them. However, there's a lack of direction and support from the federal government, which used to play an important role, but has virtually left the scene in recent years. In other words, school leaders are even more overwhelmed with the many, many challenges they need to overcome. So, talking about Sobral, Sobral is a municipality located in an extremely dry region in the state of Ceará, in northeastern Brazil. It has a population of 210,000 inhabitants, much of which living in with very low income. The vast majority of students in Sobral attend public schools. What happened is that in the year 2000, a survey showed that half of the students up to the 9th grade attending municipal schools were illiterate. I'm saying up to the 9th grade, and they were still illiterate. So the discovery surprised the local leaders, who decided to undertake a true crusade to make 100% of children literate in a period of 4 years. The objective was not only achieved, but Sobral began to excel in national standardized tests. This true educational revolution was based on some basic principles, such as the political commitment of local leaders and the social awareness that they created around two key ideas. One being school failure cannot be tolerated, and the second being every child has the potential and the right to learn. A third principle was the adoption of simple but very efficient management strategies, focusing on pedagogical results. And the fourth, just to list the main ones, was precisely the selection and training of powerful school leaders. This last principle was crucial to Sobral's educational progress. School leaders are the heart of Sobral's educational system. However, it's important to highlight that the training of these leaders focus on their personal development, in changing their mindset and attitudes, so that they have like high expectations towards their students and teachers, believe in the importance of evaluating and monitoring each child's learning, and to be also open to finding effective solutions to ensure that everyone learns without no one left behind. So Sobral's principals make every effort to reach their learning goals and have the full support of the Department of Education to do that, with which they meet weekly to align expectations and outline common strategies. So Sobral also relied on educational research to make decisions based on evidence and good practice. So it was no miracle, but a very articulated set of strategies and initiatives that made Sobral excel and be now one of the best examples of delivering quality education with equity in our country.
Thank you so much for that, Anna. Really appreciate those sort of grounding this conversation in the reality of a community. And I think that's always important as we have these global discussions to really root our perspective in a local initiative, in a local community, to see how this actually impacts the lives of children. I'm just going to bring in Toby Linden here now. Toby is with the World Bank, as Juan had mentioned. And Toby, it's been many years since I saw you in India, but it's nice to see you again. And you've done so much good work around governance in education, both looking at India as well as other countries in your role sort of at the World Bank, looking around the world. And I wonder if you could maybe provide a global context to Anna's very vivid example of Sobral, and talk about how you think about school leadership as an issue in the governance of the education system when you look at take a global perspective on it.
Thanks very much, Asad, and yes, Dee, good to see you again, and I'm very much looking forward to learning from the other presenters on this panel and the comments and questions from the audience. And actually, just a few kind of reflections, which in some ways very much start from what Anna was saying, that if we think about where we are now in sort of educational terms, this is a really important time. I mean, it's no news that the pandemic has caused massive learning loss around the world. And effective school leaders, as Anna quite rightly pointed out, effective school leaders are going to be essential for that response. But pre-pandemic, education wasn't effective. You know, half of the world's population, young children, couldn't read by the age of 10. And again, I think the evidence shows that effective school leaders are going to be essential for that response as well. So nothing could be more important than the topic today. And I see now kind of we're a bit of, if I might put it this way, a tipping point between optimism and pessimism. On the one hand, on the optimistic side, what I find fascinating, and Anna kind of illustrated that from her experience, the pandemic response was about doing something completely different, doing something at scale and doing it in a very short period of time. You know, countries tried to move to home delivery, they tried to do it for everyone, and they tried to get it going within a few months, right? And I think many of us in the education reform community have been calling for sort of some radical transformation of education to tackle many of the challenges, low learning that Anna also identified. And we saw that there were some systems, or at least some schools in some systems, that were able to respond to the pandemic and do something completely different. And I guess my hypothesis, and it'd be interesting what others think, but one hypothesis would be a key part of those successful responses were effective school leaders. So where you had effective school leaders, this transformation of the delivery of education was able to take place. But of course, many systems, indeed perhaps most systems, did not pass the COVID test. And this is where the pessimism comes in. They weren't able to create new ways of learning. They weren't able to do things effectively. Even after being 1 year out of face-to-face learning, they hadn't been able to put into place effective responses. But maybe I'm a bit optimistic also, though, that maybe the seeds of that transformation, of the possibility of transformation of education, of doing something completely different, maybe those seeds have been planted. And I would argue that if that seed is there, this is going to be a really important condition in order to help school leaders take that transformational action, that they're empowered now. Things do need to be done differently. Let's not make the same mistakes as in the past. And therefore, I would see from the kind of global perspective two big questions that I see we face. So the first is what I might call a little bit of the politics or the political economy. So has the pandemic created a context in which it's okay to say we need to do things differently? Has it created the context in which school leaders can say it's important to do things differently, and I'm able to do things differently? And how can we support that context, that authorizing environment, to help the school leaders take the actions that they want to take? You know, do we need to frame it as, I would say, like climate change, in that it's going to be something it's an emergency, but it's going to take decades? Or is it more like a flood where it's an emergency and all hands on deck, and within a couple of years, we're going to be able to make a transformation? So how do we help frame this moment to help the school leaders make those changes that we want them to make? And then secondly, as we think about the school leaders themselves, how do we conceptualize the role? And here I'm thinking in particular of whether we see a difference between leadership for change, to bring about a transformation, and leadership in what I might call normal times. And there's I guess a kind of stereotype that leaders for change, they are tough and they take difficult decisions, or they bang heads together and they're given extraordinary powers to make a change. They change teachers, they fire teachers or whatever, they make a radical change. Whereas whereas school leaders for normal times, they take a more consensus building approach. Even if they want to do things quite differently, they bring people along, they bring the teachers along. The change comes from within rather than from outside. And again, in this moment of dynamic change in response to the crisis, what kind of leaders do we want? Are there different kinds of leaders for this moment? And if that is the case, how do we then think about the selection and the training of principals of school leaders in order that they have the right skills, both for the significant change, but then also to carry forward that change in normal times, when consensus and community engagement is more important. These are the questions that I see the countries in which we work struggling with, to how to orient and articulate the challenges and the role of school leaders and how they can bring about change. Thanks very much indeed. I'm very much looking forward to hearing the rest of the interventions.
Thank you, Toby. I really appreciate those remarks, as in some ways they so help to contextualize what Anna was saying about Brazil. I'm now going to turn the conversation to George Werner, who served as the Minister of Education in Liberia. George will recall being a part of GSL's first webinar about 1.5 years ago, when webinars were a new thing, and we were all very excited about them, although it was obviously within the context of this emerging pandemic, which we had no idea would last 1.5 years. But George, at that time, you had said that it was important for educational leadership to balance meeting the immediate needs of communities with the longer term goals of the system. So in a sense, reflecting what Toby was saying about, the education systems were not great to begin with before the pandemic, and have now been hit by this massive shock of the pandemic. So I just wanted to ask you to reflect upon what you said 1.5 years ago, and to just think about how you've seen the role of education leaders play out in Liberia, and also from your perspective now, as you look more globally, how has that played out on a more global scale as well? George?
Yeah, thank you, Azza. Thank you, and good to see everyone again. Look, as has been mentioned earlier in more broader terms, we in Liberia, then as at now, we faced a situation that was unprecedented, right? Unknown in many ways. So the way I look at it in terms of what to do globally, there are skills that I think school leaders ought to have to face the moment. One, of course, as we mentioned, is resilience, the critical thinking, prioritizing, delegating. So these skills are very important, because we found that when the shadow of Ebola was waning, we needed to return to some degree of normalcy. And that meant, first of all, we needed to reinforce the confidence even of school leaders to return them to a safe environment. If school leaders had the confidence, teachers had the confidence, this would be passed on to families, and the families would trust enough to bring their children to school. So changing minds and changing attitudes from the very beginning. The psychosocial aspects, very, very key in leaders. The other thing is communications. We felt that it was important to reinforce the communication skills of school leaders. And that meant bringing in some community radio networks to be able to pass on information very quickly to parents, and for there to be a feedback loop from school leaders in the periphery at the service delivery point to central decision makers. So communications was seen as very important. The third thing is, once we got out the information and parents were confident and school leaders were confident that the environment was ready for students to return, we faced a very big issue in terms of supply and demand. Demand was high. Many children wanted to be in school, but when they came to school, we failed in many ways to create what I call then equal access to quality education. We had good teachers, but teachers were very few. Good teachers were very few. We needed learning materials. We needed to make sure that we were bringing these children back, not to restore what was, but to do something radically different in the classroom. And so this was one of the challenges that we needed to prepare the school leaders for, and to get them to think out of the box, not just what was going on or what they were used to being school leaders, principals for in the past, but to see a new context and to take advantage of the new context to improve learning outcomes. And this was where we began to expand the school community. Look at, in a way, as COVID is, we are defeating COVID, and we defeated Ebola primarily because of engagement, community engagement. And for people to see this, to reinforce the capacities of the communities in which schools are located, so that there can be some kind of reciprocity between the community school leadership, parents, a give and take, and there can be a buy-in in terms of what reforms that we initiate. So yes, there are global lessons in that context has been spelled out again, but most importantly is to position school leaders to be able to be self-confident enough to lead in a new environment where they are being challenged on every level, particularly emotionally.
Thank you, George, for those introductory remarks, and I will come back to you in a minute, but I wanted to just switch to Beatriz from who works with the OECD now, to just take what you're saying and just put it again back into a little bit more of a global context. So Beatriz, you've studied school leadership around the world globally for many years. In the last year and a half, you as well as we have observed that schools have had to take a lead in independently addressing the education needs of their learners. As George just mentioned, how do you place the community at the center of the work? And school leaders have now been asked to do so much in these times in terms of keeping schools open and keeping the community engaged and keeping learners learning at some level. And so through this process over the last year, we certainly have seen school leaders come into the spotlight as frontline leaders in their communities. So Beatriz, could you maybe elaborate on what you're seeing as the role that school leaders have played, maybe reflecting upon George's comments in terms of what he's seen in Liberia, So just elaborating on the role that school leaders have played, and do you see this as a turning point for governments to start investing more systemically in school leadership? So Beatrice, could I ask you to come in?
Yes, thank you very much, Azad, and thank you, George and Toby and Anna. I think we're all really discussing in the same direction on the vital role that school leaders play in delivering education in their schools. And I think that COVID has really put the role of school leaders at the forefront. And so it's, school leaders not only improve the performance or help the performance of their own schools, but they also, as we're seeing and we've seen with COVID, is that they moderate the external context or the external environment. So they're really key to make sure that schools are safe, schools can deliver education, schools are really doing the best for their children under external conditions. And so this external changing landscape is really what's changing the role of school leaders so much. And we're seeing that from my perspective, I'm working with different education systems to bridge the gap between education policy and practice. And George was talking about reforms and Toby about the political economy. And, we can change, one leader can change one school, but if all school leaders are not empowered to do what is right for their own schools and to have the skills to deliver education in their own schools, nothing can happen. So for me, this bridging this gap between education policy and practice is at the heart, and school leaders are actually at the heart. And this has been a changing landscape, not only because of COVID, but even before we started to see how the process of reforms is changing. And it's no longer linear. It's no longer, the ministries define and draft these beautiful papers and then hope that everybody in the field will take them on board and make them reality, such as the examples of curriculum reforms or evaluation, teacher evaluation. There are these documents that policymakers that we draft, or many of us that we work with draft, don't happen if school leaders are not there to make them happen, if they're not involved, if they don't understand, if they don't believe in this. So this process has been changing quite a lot from this linear perspective of school leaders, of reforms by policymakers, to engaging school leaders, teachers, and other actors in shaping and engaging the community, as George was saying, in shaping what happens next. And COVID has been an example of this. At the beginning of the COVID pandemic, we've done some surveys at the OECD. And in the first wave, we saw that many policymakers didn't make any decisions. So it was school leaders who made, and teachers and the school teachers who made all the decisions of what needed to be done next. And we saw many education systems where within 1 week, their schools were online. It was quick, and it wasn't the ministry, it wasn't departments of education, it was actually the teachers and the professionals who were on the ground who were really making their own alternative arrangements without the government. And so the governments or ministry officials were late. It was very difficult to know what to do. And so, but schools and their leaders know how to deliver education. So they had their own capacity to do that and move forward. And it was, a great example of empowerment, of allowing them to do what they're best at doing. And but there's been more changes also. There's been the rise of even more the recognition of how important equity has been and how schools can reach out and what they can do. And well-being has also come into the forefront much more than before. And so schools now also have to handle well-being as well. So this is a change for school leaders. But furthermore, there's been adjustments to the school calendar, to the curriculum, to external tests, all kinds of flurry of changes that are coming through, and some systems, maybe month by month. So many changes going around that it's difficult for school leaders have to handle these and interpret these for schools. And it must be, many of you, I think some of you have been principals, And many of you listening are principals, and how can you handle all these difficult uncertainty, moments of change? And so this is actually, it is becoming the practice of uncertainty, the practice of change. And so this role, the external contextual factors that influence the role of school leaders are taking a much wider dimension in the practice of school leadership. And so we have to see how to prepare leaders, to give them the right space for this to happen. And so we've seen lessons from COVID have been, well, that there is a place for policy and a place for schools, and that policy can prioritize safe schooling, set the right guidelines, health and education guidelines, the curriculum, provide support for equity, provide professional development and networks, provide data, provide resources for professionals and schools, and at the system level, provide technology, infrastructure, provide decisions on how to assess students and provide funding. But at the school level, there's a key role for schools to prioritize the school community, which has become so important in times of COVID. We've seen clearly the role, all the kids wanted to go back to school to be with their friends, with their teachers, with their community. And this has been quite a lesson for us, I think, across the OECD, how important schools are as a community, not only as a learning community, but as a much more wider social network for children. Schools have had to set up online or real or hybrid models of learning. They've had to decide, and they can decide, the learning priorities for their kids. In terms of the education professionals and schools at the school level, they can innovate. They understand they can set up the right collaborations and develop their own capacity, understand their own needs, and develop training programs for themselves as well, and engage with others to make sure that this happens. Reach out to parents, to families. And then at the system level, they also have to gauge student learning and make policy coherence at the school level. And so the role of schools and school leaders has become more complex, more uncertain, and much more linked to the external, to the role that they have to do to interpret the external context for their local school community. So they have to be much more context driven than before in terms of their social demographics, decentralization, school autonomy, accountability. All countries are now introducing new curriculum that are competency or knowledge, competency, and values-based. And this is very complex for schools to embrace. And so school leaders have to shape this for it to happen well. So it's school leadership now is at the heart of change in schools. And I think we need to recognize now more than ever. I've been working this field since, or did a large international study already in 2000. We started in 2005. And have been quite a defendant on the role of school leaders, and it's moved so slowly, to tell you the truth. I watched, and I think global school leaders, Assad, we've been in contact for a few years now, and it's now starting to take the position that it needs to take. And we need to support school leaders the best we can to make sure that they can, respond to this context, that they have the skills, the preparation, the support, especially, not autonomy without support, but the support that they need to be able to make the changes that they need to make for their own schools at the right time. So I'll stop here, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Beatrice. And there's so many questions that I think I'd love to have other folks on the panel reflect upon. But before we get there, I just wanted to bring in Asya as well from the Gates Foundation, to just get a little bit more, to just extend this global perspective a little bit more before we get back to, seeing how these issues play out at a country level. Before I bring Asya in and ask her a question, I did want to acknowledge the passing of Giren Bihari, who was a colleague to many of us on the call, and Asia's former colleague at the Gates Foundation, who's a dear friend and advisor to so many of us in the education world who passed away recently. We really miss his presence and wisdom. So Asia, what I wanted to ask you about was, you've had a long career as both an educator and the system, as Toby was introducing you. I was struck by the range of experiences you've had. So maybe using your experience as the stage for your comments, if you could talk about how you see these systemic education reforms efforts playing out around the world, and what you see as the school and district level leadership issues that matter, and what questions are you seeing, are you asking yourselves about school leadership as you've explored this area? So sorry, there's a number of questions in there, but at its core, I guess, what are you seeing around school and district level leadership as in this changing context, as the other speakers have pointed out? So Asya, over to you.
Thank you, Azad. I want to start by reflecting on, I suppose, my most favorite time, which was as a teacher in the classroom, and something I want to return back to. And at the start of summer holidays, you appreciated that time to wind down, but the worry was 6 weeks, children would have forgotten everything. And how do we quickly catch up on what they've lost over the summer holidays? And you reflect on this now, and Anna sort of brought it to life really vibrantly. Some students have missed 2 years of schooling, and the role of school leaders has always been of problem solving, and they had a lot on their plates before the pandemic. And now there's new problems we haven't been able to articulate, let alone start thinking about solving. So there's issue of learning loss, the learning that is being lost because children forget to remember summer holiday, and learning that's been missed. So they've missed 2 years of learning and forgotten, in some cases, 2 years of learning and forgotten the past. Then there's the social and emotional aspect, and this was getting children ready to learn. So, this is how things are done. This is where your books are. This is where your equipment are. This is what homework's about. This is how you sit and concentrate and listen. That part of that training. And then there's the emotional aspect of children who have suffered loss, who've not been engaging with each other. They've not had that social interaction. So the pandemic's really brought home the centrality of schools and the role of school leaders as part of community aspects. So there's a lot on the plates of school leaders. So district and school leadership matters. They are, as Beatrice said, they're the translators and brokers of policy. They make it real in many different contexts. They set the culture of how things are done around here, what we care about, how we treat each other. And they set expectations, the Sobral example that all of our children can learn and will learn. We need to understand how to make that happen. So this no excuses culture, they translate their vision into clear goals and plans and follow through on this. And they provide the support and resources to do that, have a focus on improving the quality of teaching and learning. And importantly, they know their students, they know their community, and use this knowledge to drive improvements. But look at the context even before the pandemic. The focus of our small team in global education, something that Giren had set up, was this key statistics of 9 out of 10. If you are born in a high-income country, by the age of 10, 9 out of 10 children will be able to read. If you're born in a low-income country, 9 out of 10 will not be able to read. This was before the pandemic. The World Bank estimated 53% of children globally could not read by the age of 10. Recent last week's estimates are 70% will not be able to because of the pandemic. So we have to really think about what does that mean for accelerating the progress that needs to be made. And the way systems are thinking about it is first of all increasing the focus on literacy and numeracy. And by that, looking at the key objectives that children need to be acquiring, and without acquiring them, other learning cannot take place. The second aspect is increasing the time for that learning to take place. So how do we prioritize the time to ensure these essential key competencies, key objectives are made? And thirdly, it is about improving the quality of teaching so that what was happening before with that 9 out of 10 statistics, we don't have that same situation here. So in terms of how we focus on leadership, my experience in the UK has been really the importance of leadership for all of the reasons that I said, and it's informing every aspect. But we measure leadership in Ofsted, where I was an inspector, based on the outcomes that were achieved by children. What are children learning? How well are they supported to continue their education and go on to further things? We know that effective leadership is focused on improving the quality of teaching and learning, and we know it is distributed. That is not just in the hands of one person in the school. There is subject leadership, there's phase leadership, there's community leadership, and often overlooked student leadership. Again, going sort of back into high income context, there is professional qualifications associated with leadership. There is, the national professional qualification of school leadership, national leadership education, subject leadership. But effective leaders know the policy. They can talk the talk, but they can also walk the walk. They can step into a classroom, they can model teaching, they can coach their teachers, and they ask really good questions. And the most important question they ask is, who isn't learning and what are we doing about it? And that is a question we need to be asking at every layer, not at just the school leadership, at the district leadership, at the national leadership and global. And we have a paucity of data to be able to do that, which needs improvement on. We haven't had as strong a focus on school leadership. And the way in the foundation we look at something like that is to really try and understand it. So the questions we're asking is school leadership important? There will be many who will be saying that's an obvious question. The answer is going to be yes, but let's pull ourselves back. Let's ask, is it important? If it is important, why is it important? How is it important? And what do leaders do that make it important? What do we know about effective school leadership? In low and middle income country settings, are there lessons to be learned from high income settings? What is the expectation of school leaders versus the reality of what they are able to do in LMICs, low and middle income countries? And do they have the agency to do this? Do they have the skills to do this? And do they have the agency to do this? How does this agency manifest itself? I'm very interested in what are the outliers in same settings. And I visited 2 schools in Gujarat. They were only 10 minutes apart, government schools. One school, the first one I went to, there was a vibrancy as soon as you stepped in. Children were happy, teachers were speaking, focusing on marking, etc. The school leader had made links internationally, was using this to inform, and quite impromptu pulled me into a meeting, a whole staff meeting that he called to have a question and answer session with me. And I was able to say, this is the proportion of children who are meeting our learning objectives. This is not, we have QA'd it, etc. 10 minutes into a car, another school, same context. And the head teacher was only able to talk about school meals to me. And the deputy was only able to say about school meals. So their attention was focused on that. What causes these differences to happen? So I think the outliers is really interesting. UNICEF's just data must speak aspect on Lao. They talked about highly effective school leaders emphasize teacher support. They give feedback to parents on students' learning. They foster trust, respect, and innovation. So we need to understand what they do, and then we need to understand what are the mechanisms to scale it and what are the public goods associated with it, so that what the outliers are doing doesn't become the outliers, that becomes the average, and we're lifting the level of school leadership. So I hope I answered some of your questions. I'm happy to come back to more.
Thank you, Asya. And I think Beatrice will have some comments for you, which I think could take a few seminars on its own in response to some of the questions you're thinking about. But let me actually take the conversation back to George, actually, because I think some of what has been talked about is this conversation about the schools becoming a community and school leaders becoming the translator of policy to the communities. Now, George, Anna had referenced this survey that global school leaders had done around the world. And one of the things this is a survey of school leaders in low and middle income countries. And a couple of things we found was that many school leaders are reporting learning losses as students return to schools. And interestingly for me, because I had never really heard about school leaders talking about mental and emotional health till the beginning of the pandemic, when George, I recall you saying that school leaders would have to be dealing with these issues that pop up as a byproduct of the health emergency that we were facing. George, what I wanted to ask you was, as you reflect upon sort of the centrality of the schools as a community institution and the leadership within that, and what do you see as some of the critical investments that both in Liberia as well as around the world, ministries of education need to make in school leaders to strengthen their role to strengthen the school leaders' role as we reemerge from the pandemic?
Oh, thank you, Azad. And Asiad made a very good point, and I think, as you said, Beatrice will provide it. But one of the things I find is that the quality of any school cannot surpass the quality of its leadership. And the evidence, I'm sure Beatrice will provide that, Asiad, to the Gates Foundation. But in terms of investment in school leadership, I look at communications infrastructure and providing feedback loops. When you decentralize, you run into problems of coordination and collaboration. And so we need to build a stronger communications architecture around school leadership, whether it is within the community in which the school is situated with the entire ecosystem there, PTAs, parents, with other schools, so that there is some degree of quality communication at all levels. The other thing is we need to invest in clarifying, agreeing first, and publicizing the roles and responsibilities between the ministry and school leaders. It has to be clarified. What is the role of a school leader in the village? And what does that role have to do with the central ministry issuing all these policy documents? I think we need to invest in that a little bit. And then we need to establish some degree of school level monitoring and evaluation protocols that incentivize optimal school leadership. It's important that evaluation for oneself as a leader, for also for encouragement, for professional development, for reinforcement at all levels. That stronger school level monitoring and evaluation protocols will help school leaders to really see themselves as some kind of carriers of a vision for the school in terms of what should be done in the moment. Somebody made reference earlier of a simple change in school calendar, things that can be controversial. How does a school leader deal with all the avalanche of emotional reactions to change? How does he or she manage change? So these are maybe three simple things: communications, the roles and responsibilities, school level monitoring and evaluation that are not that expensive to invest in. But if we clarify that they could empower school leaders at the local level, I'll stop there for now, Azad. Thank you.
Thank you, George. And I have to say, as the parent of a 15-year-old, changes in a school calendar make a big difference in everyone's lives. So I sense that could be a controversial topic. But Anna, I wanted to come to you actually. One of the things that George just mentioned was clarity of the role of the school leader. And Brazil has this unique, well, I don't know how unique it is, but to us it stands out, the system around the election of school leaders as opposed to the selection of school leaders. So in many municipalities, school leaders are elected to these positions. And I know that you've done a lot of work in the recent times around creating competencies for school leaders at a national level that will then play out at a local level. So I was wondering, Anna, if you could just speak to this, the movement in Brazil around creating competencies for school leaders, and how you see that complementing or eventually maybe supplementing the election of school leaders to their posts. So Anna, could I ask you to come in, please?
Yeah, thank you, Azad. So I would say that as part of this new organization that we are creating, the Lemon Center, we are trying to develop a very broad training program for school leaders here in Brazil. Of course, what we want is to inspire governments to do it by themselves, but the idea is to start the movement. And actually, we started it by creating like a competency framework to try to do what George has mentioned, to clarify the roles and the skills that the school leaders have to have and to obtain in order to do their best to tackle all the problems that they are responsible for. But what is I'll say that we built this competency framework thinking about 3 dimensions, right? So the mindset shift, all the emotional, attitudinal, like behavioral skills, the dimension of this systemic approach. So all the managerial, but especially the strategic skills that they have to have in order to tackle very complex problems that require, or they are caused by multiple factors and require multiple strategies to be overcome. And of course, the operational capacity, which is also very important, because most of the principals in Brazil, they are former teachers and who had never had a chance to really study or develop their skills as leaders, as school managers. So it's very important to also ensure this to them. But what happened is that in Brazil, as Azad mentioned, principals are appointed by political reasons or through direct elections. They are elected by students and teachers and school staff members. And what happened is that most of these appointments or the votes that they receive doesn't really consider their competency to really assume the responsibilities that they have to. So the idea that we are now creating a platform for it's an accreditation platform, a free platform with all these competencies very well structured, so that candidates, it doesn't matter if they are candidates for a political appointment or for elections, they have to be accredited through this platform. so that will ensure that they will be able to really deal with the challenge that they have to deal with. So this is one of the things that we are trying to do. What happened is that we also understood that while training school leaders, we have to train all the education leaders within the school system. Not only the principals, but also the people that are in charge of the departments of education, the leaders and the technicians, to really create a flow that will allow decision making to be made in a more collaborative, participatory way, that everybody would be aligned with the same goals and results. They will be working in a more collaborative way to really attain all the goals that they are committed to. So our program, for instance, if the municipality join it, so all the leaders have to join the program at the same time, all of them. So the idea is to really foster a culture and to help the elaboration of more consistent policies and practices, but throughout the system, not only policies that are designed by the central administration, and they have to be implemented by school leaders and school communities, but something that can be more organic and more consistent to what is needed and to what is feasible. So that's some of the strategies that we are trying to implement here.
Super, thanks, Anna. Beatriz, I want to come to you next. One of the central themes of the Limon Center's work in Brazil is around inequities in education. In Brazil, of course, it tends to be primarily racial inequities that people are looking at. But I think one of the themes we've seen from the pandemic, Beatriz, is this highlighting of the inequality in various aspects, right? And certainly in the education system, as Asya had pointed out earlier, we deal with a highly inequitable system where those 9 out of 10 numbers, which I thought were very, very arresting in terms of the vividness in which they describe the situation of inequality. But Beatriz, I was wondering if you could just reflect on the role that you see school, and I know you've done a lot of work on this. So what role do you see school leaders playing in addressing equity issues in different countries that you've looked at?
I think this is the holy grail question. It's a difficult one, but what we've seen is that definitely COVID has magnified the issue of inequality, and we've seen some examples of schools doing outreach to encourage the return of vulnerable populations to schools, or to track those, to find through the school to track those who are not returning, to also make changes at the school level in terms of water or hygiene or sanitation, and reviewing access policies. And, school leaders are the ones that can set the right conditions for children to feel part of the school community. And often what we've seen in disadvantaged schools is that the community doesn't believe in the disadvantaged schools and their capacity to lead. So at the heart is setting an environment where the key issue is that everybody can learn, and the teachers are there to teach everybody. And changing that mentality at the school level is at the heart of what school leaders can do at the beginning, to set the right environment for disadvantaged students to learn. But there are so many more other issues. Outreach to parents and to the community are much more important in disadvantaged schools than in advantaged schools. So schools have a role to play, really, and the principals to set up connections with the external community that are much stronger. So liaising with parents and with community leaders as well. Now, the issue, in terms of equity, we see that there are structural features to equity and school level, things that can be done. And so school leaders cannot be expected to solve a problem that is societal and that is structural in many ways. So when you have education systems that have, fully open school choice systems, you have, much more schools, a cleavage between advantaged and disadvantaged schools. When you have early tracking systems, you have more inequalities. And so there are a lot of things that are beyond the role of school leaders and are much more at the policy level that need to be integrated much more into the system, and then have the complement of school leaders and what they can do at the school level to support equity. And I think that the role of school leaders are just so large, and there's so little preparation for all the expectations that they're, expected to take on, which is equity, which is responding to well-being, to health, to new curricula, to new reforms, to evaluation of all their teachers, to, I know some countries where they spend 3 months trying to decide what will be the bonus for some teachers, and rather than focused on the student and the learning of their students. So there's so many roles and responsibilities. And when you look often at these, at the competencies that, the list of competencies that some education systems prepare for their school leaders, they are so long, and there are lists and lists of 40 and 50 tasks that they're supposed to comply with every year that none of us could be able to comply. So I think really focusing on what is the core of what they need to be doing, and it is to set the school vision and their priorities, and to establish the right conditions for teaching and learning to happen well at the schools, and then to liaise with the external content. So these would be the 3 core tasks, I think, that much of the evidence has demonstrated that make a difference in a school. Now, Astia was saying that, from the gates, you want to really see the evidence. What does the evidence say about effective school leaders? And that is such a difficult question, because much of the evidence has shown that it's indirect, and that it's through their role on teachers that they're able to set the right environment for effective teaching and learning. And there's been very few studies, I think one in Texas, where they measured, it was Branch et al. In 2013, where they measured the impact, and it was about teacher turnover and how happy teachers were in their schools, and teachers not leaving, that they were able to improve their results between 3 and 7 months in children's learning. But it's very difficult to measure directly the impact they have. And I think maybe the Data Must Speak project that you're talking about, actually one of my team members has just come back from Laos and was working on this project, and the school deviant projects, to measure what are the differences from a school that outperforms others in similar conditions, and is that leadership? What is it in leadership that does this? And I think we see that in the corporate world? Can we measure that in the corporate world? Can we measure that in education? Is difficult, but so I do think we do have the evidence of the indirect impact that they play in school, and we need to believe in that in some way, and continue measuring. And maybe I'll add one more thing about, George was talking about evaluation systems, and we've also seen many education systems introduce evaluation systems that evaluate teachers and school leaders. And what we're seeing as well is that, at least I'm seeing from my perspective supporting education systems, that when the education systems don't set up objectives that are tangible. It's very difficult to request schools to respond to objectives that are not really clearly spelled out. And so an education system says, okay, so we want all our schools to be successful schools. Well, what does that mean? And then only then can you set up evaluation systems at the school level and how they respond to these objectives, rather than asking schools to deliver on a number of objectives that are not clear at the national level. So it's important that there is coherence in evaluation systems at the school level and evaluation systems at the national level. And I'll stop here.
Super. Thanks, Beatrice. Really appreciate your comments. Asya, I wanted to move back to you actually now to just now take, so we've heard, and one of the questions from in the Q&A was sort of asking about this thing of, we've heard so many ideas around policies and the importance of different policies and the importance of school leaders, and how do we contextualize all this, Asya, in terms of, as you think, one of the things I, having followed the Gates Foundation's work on this, on education over the last few years, I feel like one of the things that you've been able to do really well is to synthesize these very complex demands on education systems and come up with some pretty crisp ideas around what can be done, around how can things be organized. So I was wondering, Asya, and Toby, I'll come to you after Asya, but Asya, I was wondering if you could just reflect upon, as you've heard these various policy ideas that have emerged from this conversation, as well as the reflection on the role of the school leaders in this time. Could you maybe just reflect upon how you would think about what policies are important for education ministries to think about, and how should they be thinking about school leadership within the context of those policies?
Thanks for that. And I'm glad you came to me, because I wanted to respond to Beatrice with this, not everything, that phrase, not everything that can be measured is important, and not everything that is important can be measured. And schools are such diverse, integrated, I don't want to use the word complex, but I will, systems. There's so many things happening that we're not going to be able to pick one thing and say that's the one that drives it. I think George's point about the communication, there's something about the coherence to act. Is everybody in the system focused on the same few things? They cannot be focused on everything. There's something about prioritization. And if they're focused on the same thing, are school leaders being asked the same questions by those that they are accountable to? Or and so this bit about communication of school leadership's role, there's one that's up to the system, there's one that's down to the students and the teachers, and there's another one that's across, and that's learning from other school leaders and finding what works and contextualizing it. I want to go back to a role I had in Ofsted, and people sort of think Ofsted just inspects schools, we inspect policy as well. And one of the things that was a really joy to do was to visit national leaders of education, which were schools in challenging circumstances that went above and beyond. There were the sort of the Sobral examples within the UK, and amazing head teacher, which had schools, children very, very high poverty, lots of social issues as well. And I asked, what was he doing? And he said, it's very simple. We show them what needs to be done. So we are very clear about the goals, the expectations, how we do things. We give them the resources to do it, which is the training, the coaching, the time to study, to understand, to learn from others. And then importantly, we check it's being done. And that checking has that support side and that challenge side. And that's that really resonated with me. And I think there's learning from that when we reflect as schools are trying to address the learning losses. We know there are some things that work and structured pedagogy, which is the alignment of the curriculum, the assessment, the teacher training, and the coaching, the lesson guides, has across many, many contexts shown it can be worked. What is the role of school leaders to translate it, to contextualize it, to support their teachers to take up? I think that is less studied. So we need to study that. We know assessment-informed instruction works, which is the same, it's the family of brackets that has teaching at the right level in it. It's why personalized adaptive learning in computing works. So it's asking, where are your students now? Assess them. Where do you need them to be, which is your goal setting, and let's focus the goal, the curriculum goals on the key objectives we want children to learn, and then how are you going to get them there? And how you're going to get them there is not something that can be prescribed by us sitting in our nice high-income countries or in high-income houses within this. It is what the school leaders and the district leaders do to contextualize it. Is the adaptive, the innovation within that will make a difference. And I go back to how I started, that the role of school leaders, the role of district leaders in our context needs more study. It needs more study about what are the barriers to them doing the work they need to do, what are the ones that do it more effectively, and then how do we make that, what's required to make it much more universal, so it's not outliers. But we have really good examples to learn from across many, many countries. And that study is what we need to do before we can say, in terms of school leadership, we know that this works, let's lower it out. And the examples of yourselves as global school leaders who are bringing up some of that evidence.
Thanks, Asia. Toby, I'd like to move to you now. And actually, I'm reminded that time flies when you're having fun, and this has been such an interesting discussion, and we're almost about to wrap it up. But Toby, I was wondering, as you address this issue of, when you think about all the competing priorities in the education space, how does one make sense of how to prioritize and what role can school leaders play in this? I think if you can also just maybe add in a few reflections. There was a question that was actually directed towards Ana about the scalability of the Sobral example in Brazil. But I think, this question, and I think this issue of positive deviance has come up a few times here, and there was a study out of Kenya by Sheila Wamahiu a few years ago around positive deviance in Kenya as well, where they found school leadership being a critical factor in these positive deviance schools. So I think that seems to be a recurring theme. But I guess, Toby, the question that's sitting in my mind is, we have all these various policy recommendations. We have all these various examples at a community level, at a country level, maybe, as Georgia talked about earlier. How do you see these scaling up as well to meet the needs of these policy needs of the various countries? So Toby, if I could ask you to just reflect upon that as a way of synthesizing what we've learned in this panel, that'd be great.
Thanks, Asad, and thanks to the panelists. I mean, very thought-provoking, and actually, you posed exactly the question I was a little bit grappling with as people were speaking, because at the heart of underlying a lot of what everyone was saying is that we want to have effective leaders in every school or across the country or across the community, across the district or whichever is area worth thinking about. And that for me was kind of the emerging challenge. So clearly part of it, people were saying, we need to define the role of the principal effectively. And I'd like the way that several people, Anna, for example, talked about the competency framework, setting the right expectations. Only then can you then talk about building an expected set of training programs to help support leaders to acquire those skills. That then links to the kind of expectations that you're going to have of those school leaders, judging their performance, but also in turn them setting the right expectations in the context of their communities. So these sort of system level things are going to be important to helping set some expectations about what school leadership looks like, and that it is a thing that can be found everywhere. And I think this might be my second point in terms of how we think about school leaderships. We mustn't make it so that a school leader is a superhuman, right? And there I take it partly that's a reflection of the competency framework. It must be realistic, right? That this is possible to be realized. But it also relates to a point a couple of people made about what I would call distributed leadership, not just invested in a single person, but many people are taking a leadership role at the school level. Because, and this is the third point I wanted to reflect on, that the role of leadership is a very complex thing, and it's been particularly complex at this time, in a time of crisis, and we've seen some effective responses, but many have not. But it is a complex task at the best of times. It's especially complex during a time of crisis, and there's no way that a single individual can be the change, can be the whole change. And fourth, then, the important role of communication, I thought, came through very, very well here. Communicating with the community, making sure everybody's on the same page. I found this a very thoughtful way of thinking about the role. Is everybody on the same page? Does everybody have the same priorities? Is everybody aware of their role in supporting those priorities? This did strike me as related to then the next issue, which I thought we probably haven't spoken enough about more broadly, which is this sort of social, psychological aspects to the role, and how we help. We don't want, maybe I put it this way, we don't want to be in a situation in which leaders are born, right? Because then we will never have enough leaders, right? We must help leaders. We must help people become leaders, and a big part of that is going to be their ability to develop relationships, to develop these socio-emotional aspects that people were thinking very important, have been exposed as being really important during the crisis. And those psychosocial aspects are to support children who also need this support, to support teachers and themselves in developing these things. But how do you help people who don't have these skills acquire them, right? That seems to me to be a very interesting and powerful idea, that not everybody, as with every kind of competency, not these competencies are not evenly distributed across a population, and there's no reason to expect everybody has very strong socio-emotional skills and the ability to empathize, sympathize, and engage and develop relationships with others. But we want people to be able to acquire those skills, and how can we help them do it? And then the last thing that I just wanted to reflect on is this question of the use of evidence. And I was struck by the Sobral example that started from evidence of what works. Asia brought it up there right at the end as, we need to start from the place of what works and enable people to use that knowledge and evidence in their local context. And again, we can't expect the school leaders to be the foundation, so the fountain which has all of the knowledge, right? We must support them to gain access to that evidence and then use it in their local context. And again, I think that I see that was a message that came through in a number of different presenters. I'm not sure whether I answered your question, Azad, but these were the reflections and things I took away from this discussion. So it was very rich. Thank you.
That's wonderful, Toby, and thank you for synthesizing it. I just want to make 3 quick remarks, and then I'll turn it over to Juan to close out. But one is, this issue of evidence for those who are in the audience. I would highly encourage you to check out the OECD website. Beatriz has done a lot of work on this. Also on the GSL, on the Global School Leaders website, we had published last year an evidence review on school leadership in low and middle income countries, which was sort of a literature review, a synthesis of what's out there as of a year ago on school leadership. So so do check those resources out. The second thing I wanted to say, Toby, is that you said that we can't expect school leaders to be superhuman. But I have to say, after working with school leaders over the last year and a half, we have expected them to be superhuman, and they have delivered on it. So I think whatever little we've seen happening around the world in the education space, in my opinion, has very much rested on the superhuman nature of school leaders to fight through their own personal challenges around COVID and around their mental health and all this, to make sure that schools have somehow continued to offer learning to their students. So a big shout out to all the school leaders around the world. And finally, thank you very much to all the panelists. It's, I think either panels are good when either you have a clear answer to your question or you leave with a lot more questions. And I think we're leaving today with a lot more questions. So really appreciate all the panelists for their thoughtful remarks. So thanks, everyone. And Juan, over to you to close out.
No, thank you, everyone. I think this has been a very interesting panel. So we will have the recording that we will distribute and promote. We conclude with this webinar, the series of 3 webinars. We are thinking of doing others, inviting other partners to participate as part of this series. So thank you very much, and have a good day, a good afternoon, a good night, depending on where you are in the world. Thank you very much.